I want you to imagine something for a second. You've given 12 years of your life to a company. 12 years. You missed your daughter's third birthday party because of a product launch. You've eaten cold pizza at your desk so many times that you stopped noticing the taste. You've defended your team in meetings where they weren't in the room, covered for your manager when he dropped the ball, and turned down 2 job offers too, because you genuinely believed that loyalty meant something. And then one Thursday afternoon in October, you find out it was all a lie. Not a small lie. Not a he stretched the truth on his resume kind of lie. A constructed, deliberate, years-long trap. And you were the mouse. That's where my story starts. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that for 12 years I worked at a mid-sized tech company in Austin, Texas, the kind of company that puts a ping-pong table in the break room and calls it a culture. We sold enterprise software. Not the sexy kind. The kind that makes sure healthcare systems can track inventory and hospitals don't accidentally order 17,000 latex gloves when they need 17. Unglamorous, critically important, and, when it worked, deeply satisfying. My team managed implementation projects. We were the people who took the software the engineers built and made it actually function inside a client's world. It's harder than it sounds. You're dealing with legacy systems that were built during the Clinton administration, IT departments who resent you for existing, and end users who would rather die than change how they've been doing things for 20 years. But we were good at it. Really good. And I don't want to brag here, but I was the person people called when things went sideways. That was my identity. The fixer. The one who stayed calm when the server crashed at 11 p.m. on a Sunday before a Monday go live. The one who knew how to talk to a frustrated hospital administrator who thought the system was personally attacking her. I was good at the human part of the job in a way that's genuinely hard to teach. Which is exactly why what happened to me. Stay with me. Because this gets complicated before it gets satisfying. You need to understand 3 people to understand this story. The first person is me, already described. 12 years in. 44 years old at the time this story takes place. Divorced, not relevant, but context. 2 kids, a mortgage in a neighborhood where the HOA sends passive-aggressive emails about holiday lighting. The classic American setup. The second person is Derek. Derek was my direct manager for the last 5 years of my time at the company. He came in from outside, a hire the VP of operations made after reading too many LinkedIn thought leader posts about transformative leadership. Derek was 48, silver-haired, the kind of guy who says let's unpack that in meetings and means it as a power move, not an invitation. He wore Patagonia vests in a climate that required them approximately 3 weeks a year. He had the energy of someone who has read every book about leadership and has never once led anyone through anything genuinely difficult. But he was charming. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Derek was enormously, disarmingly charming. He remembered your kids' names. He sent you articles about things you mentioned once, casually, 3 months ago. He had this quality, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what to call it, where he made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. Not in a slick way. In a warm way. In a this guy genuinely cares about me way. He didn't. But I didn't know that yet. The third person is Melissa. Melissa was my peer, same level as me, different portfolio of clients. She and I had started at the company the same year, which created this unspoken bond that I think we both felt more than we ever said out loud. We went through the same stupid onboarding, survived the same terrible reorg of 2016 that eliminated 14 positions, and left the rest of us doing the work of 22 people, and built the kind of work friendship that you only develop when you've been through actual fire together. Melissa was sharper than me. I've always known that. She was faster analytically, more politically savvy, and better at the uncomfortable conversations. She was also, and this is the part that becomes relevant, far more likely to be promoted. We were both aware of this. It sat between us like a thing we never named. The year this started, let's call it year 1 of Derek, things were actually good. Derek came in and immediately started reorganizing our team structure, which felt productive at the time. He created what he called pods, small groups of 3 or 4 people focused on specific client verticals. Healthcare was mine. Melissa got financial services. He gave us each more autonomy than we'd had before, more budget authority, more direct client relationships. I responded to this the way a dog responds to being given a bigger yard. I ran everywhere. I took on 2 new client accounts that nobody else wanted because they were complicated. I hired 2 new analysts onto my pod. I redesigned our implementation playbook, the actual document we used to run every project, from scratch, because the old one was a relic that hadn't been updated since 2017. I was genuinely happy. Which, in retrospect, is embarrassing to admit because happiness at work made me less careful. Derek was generous with his praise during this period. Private praise, mostly, in our one-on-ones, which he ran with what felt like genuine intention. He'd ask me questions like, "What do you think is holding this team back? And if you were in my seat, what would you do differently?" And I would answer honestly, because I thought we were building something together. I see now what those conversations actually were. He was gathering intelligence. Every opinion I shared about a colleague, every frustration I named, every structural problem I identified, he was cataloging it. I thought we were having a dialogue. He was building a file. Melissa noticed before I did. She said something to me once. We were in the parking garage after a particularly long all-hands meeting, both of us leaning against her car because neither of us had the energy to actually get in and drive home, and she said, "Does it ever feel like Derek knows things he shouldn't know?" I asked her what she meant. She shrugged. Said she'd mentioned to Derek that one of her analysts, a kid named Tom, was thinking about leaving. She'd told Derek because she thought he should know, as a management thing. 2 weeks later, Tom was called into HR for a performance review that seemed to come from nowhere. He wasn't fired. But he got a formal written warning for inconsistent output, a charge that was vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to follow him. Tom wasn't thinking about leaving anymore after that, Melissa said. I told her she was reading into things. I was wrong. Year 2 of Derek is where the story starts to turn. The company was under pressure. Healthcare software is always under regulatory pressure, but this particular year, there were new compliance requirements coming from CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and our clients were panicking. Which meant we were panicking. Which meant our implementation timelines got compressed in ways that were honestly not survivable. One of my clients, a regional hospital system in Tennessee, was struggling badly. They had an internal IT lead named Gary who was a genuine obstacle. Gary was the kind of guy who'd been there for 23 years and treated every external consultant like a personal insult to his professional existence. He stonewalled us on data access. He forgot to attend critical configuration meetings. He submitted help tickets for issues that didn't exist, which created a paper trail suggesting the software was broken when it wasn't. I documented all of this. Meticulously. I brought it to Derek in our one-on-one with a clear recommendation. We need to escalate to the client's senior leadership. This is a Gary problem, not a software problem. Derek nodded seriously. Said he'd handle it. He didn't handle it. What he did, and I only found out about this much later, was have a phone call with Gary's boss, during which he described the situation as some internal friction on our side. Suggesting the friction was mine. Suggesting I'd been difficult to work with. The project continued to struggle. 3 months later, at my annual review, Derek noted in writing for the first time that I had some challenges managing difficult stakeholder dynamics. That one sentence, buried in an otherwise positive review. I almost didn't notice it. I pushed back mildly. Derek smoothed it over, told me it was just developmental feedback, nothing to worry about. He was warm about it. Concerned sounding. I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go. There were other things that year. Small things that I categorized separately instead of seeing them as a pattern. My team's budget was quietly reduced, not eliminated, just trimmed. Derek explained it as a company-wide cost management initiative, which was plausible enough that I didn't question it. What it actually meant was that I couldn't backfill one of my analyst positions when someone left, so my pod went from 4 people to 3. A new reporting requirement appeared. Every week, my pod had to submit a detailed project status update, a document that took about 2 hours to compile, directly to Derek. None of the other pods had this requirement. When I asked about it, Derek said it was because my healthcare vertical had higher visibility with the executive team, which sounded like a compliment. I took it as a compliment. It was not a compliment. It was surveillance. And every week I submitted that document, I was building a detailed record of everything my team was doing, every decision we made, every challenge we faced, a record that lived entirely in Derek's hands. Melissa got promoted that year. Senior director. She deserved it. I told her that, and I meant it. But I noticed that I hadn't been considered, and when I raised it, very carefully, in a one-on-one with Derek, he said, with that warm, serious face, "You're so close. The Tennessee account needs to land cleanly, and then I think the path is very clear." So I put my head down and worked harder. Classic. Absolutely classic. Year 3. I need you to understand what was happening to me physically during this year, because I think it matters. I was sleeping about 5 hours a night. I developed a thing where I woke up at 3 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep because my brain was already running through project timelines. I'd gained weight. I was drinking more than I should, not in a dramatic, rock-bottom way, just in the quiet, suburban, 2 glasses of bourbon every night way that's basically invisible in American professional culture because everyone around you is doing the same thing. I was not okay, but I was functional. And functional is the thing that tricks you into thinking everything is fine. Derek, during this year, began doing something I can only describe as methodical. He started reassigning my best people. It happened gradually over about 6 months. First it was Marcus, my strongest analyst, the one I'd basically trained from scratch, who Derek said was needed for a special project in the financial services vertical. Marcus moved to Melissa's team. Then it was Sarah, my project coordinator, who was centralized into a new shared services model that Derek was building. Then, in the spring, a new client account that I'd been promised, a large regional health system that would have significantly elevated my portfolio, was quietly given to a new hire who reported directly to Derek. Each of these decisions had a reasonable-sounding explanation. Each explanation was, I believe, a lie. What Derek was doing was systematically stripping the resources away from my pod while keeping me in place, still responsible for the same accounts, still held to the same performance standards, but with progressively fewer people and less support. He was engineering my failure. The Tennessee account, which had never fully recovered from the Gary situation, began to deteriorate more visibly. Deadlines slipped. A deliverable was missed. The client, reasonably, began to escalate their frustration. I was working 80-hour weeks and still falling behind because I was now essentially a team of 2 trying to do the work of 4. I went to Derek. I told him I needed resources. I laid out exactly what I needed and why. I showed him the math, hours of work required versus hours of capacity available. It was not ambiguous. Derek looked at me across his desk with that warm, concerned face and said, "I hear you. I really do. I'm going to go to bat for you on this. Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks later, nothing had changed. I went back. He said he was still working on it. I went back a 3rd time. He said, and this is almost a direct quote, because it's burned into my memory, "I need you to find a way to make this work with what you have." I know it's hard. This is where great leaders separate themselves. That night I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes before going inside. I'm not proud of that. But I think anyone who has ever been in a slow-motion professional disaster knows exactly what that 40 minutes felt like. You're not ready to go inside because inside is the rest of your life, and the rest of your life requires you to be okay, and you are not okay, and the gap between those 2 things is exactly 40 minutes wide. Here's what I want to say about the moment you find out the truth. It is not cathartic. It is not a relief. The first feeling, before the anger, before anything else, is a strange, cold grief. Because you have to simultaneously understand the betrayal and mourn the version of the world where the betrayal wasn't happening. Both of those things hit at the same time. It's disorienting in a way I genuinely struggle to describe. The discovery happened because of a calendar invite. This sounds mundane. It was not mundane. I was looking for a document in our shared project management system. We used a platform called Basecamp, and I ended up, through a sequence of accidental clicks in a folder I'd never been in before. It was labeled with a client code I didn't recognize. Inside was a subfolder. And inside that subfolder was a meeting invite, exported as a PDF document, for a recurring meeting called HC Vertical Transition Planning. HC. Healthcare. My vertical. The meeting had been running every other week for 14 months. The attendees were Derek, 2 people from HR, the VP of Operations, Derek's boss, and, in the last 4 months, someone from a company called Pelham Group. I knew Pelham Group. They were a consulting firm. They provided outsourced project management services in the healthcare IT space. They were, functionally, a competitor to my team's function. I sat very still for a long time. Then I kept reading. There were notes attached to the meeting invites. Not full minutes, probably because someone had enough sense to know full minutes were a liability, but fragments. Bullet points. Action items. The phrases I found. Performance documentation, month 7 on track. HC pod capacity reduction, phase 2 complete. Tennessee escalation, managed per plan. Transition timeline, Q2 target, pending PIP trigger. PIP. Performance improvement plan. They had been planning to put me on a PP. Not because my performance had organically declined. Because they had systematically engineered conditions designed to make my performance appear to decline, so that they could document it and use it to replace my entire function with an outsourced firm. Derek hadn't been managing me. He'd been building a case against me. For 14 months. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where something you thought was your fault turns out to not have been your fault at all, and instead of feeling relieved, you feel this specific kind of fury that has nowhere to go? Because that's where I was. The Gary situation in Tennessee. The stakeholder dynamics note in my review. The missing resources. The weekly reporting requirement. Marcus and Sarah and the reassigned account. All of it had been deliberate. All of it was manufactured evidence in a case that had already decided its verdict before I knew there was a trial. I closed my laptop. I drove home. I poured a glass of bourbon and I sat at my kitchen table and I made a list. Not of grievances. Of evidence. I am going to be honest with you about what I considered doing. I considered doing nothing. Just leaving. Taking my LinkedIn profile, updating it quietly, and getting out before the PIP arrived. There is a version of me, a very tired version, the version that sat in the driveway for 40 minutes, who would have done exactly that. It would have been easier. Cleaner. Less emotionally expensive. But I'd been in that company for 12 years. I'd trained people who were still there. I had colleagues who were almost certainly going to be affected by the Pelham Group transition. And I'm not going to dress this up in noble language, I was furious. White-hot, clarifying, organizing fury. So instead of leaving, I documented. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked in parallel. During the day, I did my job, the job they were trying to take from me, as well as I possibly could. At night, I built a file. I pulled every email I could legally access. I documented every one-on-one conversation I could remember, with dates and as much verbatim recall as I could produce. I pulled the Basecamp records. I noted every resource reduction, every reassignment, every instance of promised support that never arrived. I created a timeline that covered, as best I could reconstruct, 22 months of coordinated action. Then I called an employment attorney. His name was Raymond, and he was one of those people who become lawyers because they are constitutionally incapable of letting injustice sit. He'd been practicing in Austin for 19 years, mostly employment law. He had the energy of a man who has seen every possible corporate maneuver and maintains his outrage about all of them through what I suspect is pure professional stubbornness. Raymond looked at my documentation for about 40 minutes. Then he looked at me. "This is a constructive dismissal case," he said. And it's a good one. Constructive dismissal, for anyone who doesn't know, is when an employer makes your working conditions so unbearable or engineers your situation so deliberately that they're effectively forcing you out. The legal standard varies by state, but in Texas, with what I had, Raymond said we had a real argument. But, he said, and here's where it got interesting, there's something more here. The Pelham Group connection meant this wasn't just about me. If the company had been planning a full-function outsourcing while managing out the internal team, there were potentially issues around severance obligations, Warren Act notifications if enough positions were being eliminated, and, depending on how the documentation had been handled, potential misrepresentation to the employees being set up. "What do you want?" Raymond asked me. "Money? Your job back? Or something else?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I want them to have to explain it," I said. Out loud. To someone. He smiled. "That," he said, "is what a demand letter does." Here's the part of the story I couldn't have predicted. Raymond sent the demand letter to the company's general counsel 3 days before Thanksgiving. It detailed the constructive dismissal argument, the documented pattern of resource manipulation, the Pelham Group meetings, and our position that I had been subject to a coordinated, premeditated campaign to manufacture grounds for termination. We expected silence, then negotiation. What we got was a phone call from the general counsel's office within 72 hours. Not a negotiation call. An information gathering call. The GC's office was not aware. I want to be very precise about what I mean. The general counsel of the company, a woman named Patricia who'd been there for 8 years, was not aware of the full scope of what Derek had been planning. She knew about the Pelham Group exploration. She knew the company was considering outsourcing options. What she did not know was that Derek had been running a coordinated HR campaign to manufacture performance documentation as cover. That had been Derek's operation. Derek's and the VP of Operations, whose name was Ron. What Derek had apparently sold to Ron was a business case about cost reduction. What he'd sold to HR was a performance management process. What he had not done, what turned out to be the critical error in his entire scheme, was properly loop in legal. Because, as Patricia explained to Raymond, the company had never authorized a coordinated plan to manipulate an employee's working conditions in order to generate false performance documentation. Derek had freelanced it. And in doing so, he had created a significant legal liability for the company, a liability that he had apparently kept from legal in order to avoid having his plans scrutinized. The next part happened quickly. Within 2 weeks of our demand letter, Derek was placed on administrative leave. Ron, the VP of Operations, went on leave the same day. The internal investigation that followed was apparently swift and not pleasant for either of them. I know this because Melissa called me. Melissa, who at this point knew roughly what had happened because we'd been talking regularly after I reached out to her, was still inside the company, still functioning, and was in a position to see some of what was unfolding. "You need to know something," she said, in a voice that was very quiet, very controlled, and very much the voice of a person sitting somewhere. "She doesn't want to have this conversation. The investigation turned up stuff about Derek. Not just about you." "What do you mean?" "Tom," she said. "The analyst. The one who'd gotten the surprise performance review after mentioning he was thinking about leaving. And 2 other people who left in the last 3 years. There are exit interviews that HR is now looking at very differently. Derek, it turned out, had done versions of this before. Not as elaborate. Not as sustained. But the pattern: identify someone he perceived as a threat or an obstacle, use management access to quietly undermine them, create documentation, engineer an exit, was apparently not new. The reason it had worked before was that his targets had left. I hadn't left. And because I hadn't left, and because I documented everything, and because I had Raymond, the pattern became visible. Here's the second twist. The one I genuinely did not see coming. The company settled with me. The terms are confidential, so I can't give you specific numbers, and I'll respect that. But it was material. It was enough that I didn't need to immediately find another job, which gave me the space to think clearly about what I actually wanted to do next. Part of the settlement involved an agreement that the company would conduct an independent review of its management practices and severance processes for the previous 3 years. A third-party auditor. This was Raymond's idea, and he was very proud of it. It wasn't legally required. But it was something the GC agreed to because, I think, Patricia was genuinely angry about what had been done under her company's roof without her knowledge, and she wanted accountability structures that would prevent it from happening again. Was it justice? I don't know. That word feels too clean for something this messy. Was it something? Yes, it was something. I've been out of that company for about 14 months as I'm recording this. I want to tell you some things I've learned, not in a self-help listicle way, but in a these are the things I actually believe now that I've been through this way. The first thing is about loyalty. Loyalty to an institution is not the same thing as loyalty to the people in it. I conflated those two things for 12 years, and that conflation cost me. The company wasn't disloyal to me. Companies aren't capable of loyalty. They're capable of interest alignment. Derek was disloyal to me. Ron was disloyal to me. The HR people who participated in the process without questioning it were at minimum complicit. But the company as an abstract entity was simply doing what companies do, pursuing its interests. The moment I understood that, a lot of my anger stopped being diffuse and became specific. Specific anger is more manageable. Specific anger tells you exactly where to look. The second thing is about documentation. Document everything. I know that sounds paranoid. I know it sounds like the advice of someone who spent too long in a legal dispute and emerged jaded. But I mean it in a neutral way, not because the world is full of directs, but because documentation is a form of clarity. When you write down what happened, what was said, what was decided, you create a record that protects everyone, including you. The habit of keeping good records isn't cynical. It's just honest. The third thing, and this is the one that took me the longest to sit with, is about the warning signs I ignored. There were moments. Melissa's observation about Tom. The stakeholder dynamics note I let slide. The resource reductions that I accepted as policy rather than questioned as pattern. The feeling I had, more than once, that something was off, a feeling I suppressed because suppressing it was easier than acting on it. I don't say this to blame myself. Derek was skilled. He was deliberate. He had a tool, the appearance of warmth and genuine engagement, that is almost perfectly designed to disarm exactly the kind of person who tends to be loyal and hardworking and trusting. But I was also complicit in my own blindness. I chose not to see things I could have seen, because seeing them would have required a confrontation I wasn't ready to have. I'm ready now. The fourth thing is about Melissa. After everything, Melissa and I have one of the best professional friendships I've ever had. Partly because going through something hard together, even when together means separately, from the inside and outside of the same crisis, creates a bond that nothing else quite replicates. Partly because she had the courage to call me with information she didn't have to share, at professional risk to herself. She's since moved to a different company. She's a VP now. I had nothing to do with that. She earned every bit of it. But I like to think that the fact that she was willing to do the right thing when it mattered was part of who she was all along, and that I was lucky enough to have known her. The fifth thing is the hardest one to say. I spent a lot of the first year after this happened trying to understand Derek. Not to forgive him, I want to be very clear that I have not forgiven him, and I'm not sure I need to in order to move forward, but to understand him. What kind of person builds something like that? What's the internal architecture of someone who can sustain a 2-year campaign of deliberate cruelty against a colleague while maintaining the performance of warmth and care? I asked a therapist I started seeing. Yes, I started therapy. Yes, I should have started sooner. Yes, you probably should too. And she said something that I've thought about a lot since. She said, people who do what Derek did usually believe they're pragmatic, not cruel. They've created a story where their ambition is justified by their competence, and anyone who stands in the way of that ambition is an obstacle, not a person. The warmth is real. It's just in service of something other than connection. I found that more disturbing than if she'd just said he was a monster. Monsters are simpler. I'm going to tell you where everyone ended up, because I know that's what you want to know. Derek was terminated. He did not face any criminal charges. What he did was ugly and calculated, but it was in the complicated zone where employment law lives, which is generally civil rather than criminal territory. He landed at another company about 8 months later. Different industry. I know this because the internet exists and I'm human. I've chosen not to think about it too much. Thinking about it gives it a weight it doesn't deserve. Ron was also terminated. He's retired now, I believe, which is the most satisfying outcome of all because it removes him from the equation entirely. The Pelham Group contract was not signed. Whether that was because of the legal situation or because the business case fell apart without Derek and Ron to champion it, I don't know. I choose to believe it was both. The independent audit that was part of my settlement was completed about 6 months ago. I don't know what was in it. I have no access to that information. But 3 people who had left the company in the previous 2 years received unexpected outreach from HR. I know this because one of them reached out to me. He'd found my name through a chain of connections, LinkedIn, mutual contacts, the small world of Austin's tech community. He wanted to tell me that he'd received a call and that some things were being reviewed. He thanked me. I sat with that for a long time. As for me, I'm consulting now. Independent. Which I thought I would hate. I'm a team person, a company person, the kind of person who defines himself partly through institutional belonging, but which I've discovered I actually love. I'm good at it. I set my own hours. I take projects that interest me. I eat lunch like a human being. I sleep better than I have in years. My daughter, who was 13 when all this happened and is now 15 and considerably smarter than me, asked me recently what the whole thing had taught me. She's at that age where she asks big questions very casually, while looking at her phone, and then listens to the answer with more attention than she's letting on. I told her, it taught me that trusting people isn't stupid, but trusting a story that someone else is telling about who you are, that's where you have to be careful. She looked up from her phone. That's actually pretty good, Dad, she said. High praise. If you've listened to this whole thing or read it or whatever version of this found its way to you, thank you. I mean that. This story is not comfortable to tell. There are parts of it that still make me angry and parts that still make me sad. And parts that I look back on with something that I can only describe as the particular embarrassment of having been someone who wanted so badly to believe in something that he stopped questioning whether it was real. But there's also something else I feel when I get to the end of it. Something I'm almost reluctant to name because it sounds too tidy for how messy the actual experience was. It's gratitude. Not for what happened. I'd trade the whole experience for those 3 years back without a second of hesitation. But for who I found out I was when it happened. For the clarity of the fury. For Raymond and his 19 years of stubborn outrage. For Melissa and the parking garage conversation that I should have listened to harder. For the fact that I didn't take the easy exit when I could have, not because I'm particularly brave, but because I was tired enough of being invisible that I was finally willing to be seen. Even in a demand letter. Even in a settlement conference. Even here. All right. That's the story. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you found out, after the fact, that something you thought was your failure was actually someone else's design? Have you ever worked for a Derek, someone whose warmth was a tool, whose care was strategic, whose management style turned out to be a long game you didn't know you were playing? Or maybe you've been in Melissa's position, someone who knew something was wrong and had to decide whether to say something and what the cost of saying it might be. Leave a comment. Seriously. Not a polished one, the messy, honest kind. The kind you'd send to a friend at 11 p.m. when you can't sleep because you're thinking about the job you're in right now and whether the pattern you've been ignoring is a pattern. Those are the comments that make this worth doing. And if this story resonated with you, if you recognized something in it, even a piece of it, even a feeling, hit subscribe. Because next week I'm going to tell you a story about a man who found out his business partner had been siphoning clients for 3 years, and the way it ended is going to make you put your phone down and stare at the ceiling for a minute. You don't want to miss it. Take care of yourselves out there. And document everything.